Should start saying, okay. Well, good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Kansas Children's Discovery Center. My name is Laura Burton. I'm our Director of Marketing here at the Discovery Center, and I am joined by Amy Hough, who I will introduce in just a moment, our pediatric sleep consultant. First and foremost, though, a quick update about the Discovery Center. Those of you who are following us know that we have recently opened our outdoor space for outdoor play. We're very excited about that. So as of this recording, you can come play with us outside at the Discovery Center, and we have lots of great infection control measures in place to keep you and your family safe. We're having the social distancing when folks are waiting in line. Masks are required anytime somebody is inside the building to use the restroom. And we're keeping us at 10% of capacity, so there's lots of space to spread out and play. We're doing that admission by time-ticketed entry. So there are 2-hour sessions, and in between those sessions, we have lots of sanitizing, and we're doing a lot of things to keep families safe. So come see us at the Discovery Center. This weekend, we expect beautiful weather. We're very excited about that, so it's a great time to come play. Check out our website at kansasdiscovery.org/playtime to get signed up and get those tickets for advanced entry. Without further delay, though, even though we're doing so many exciting things, I want to shift it over to our topic today, which is babies and sleep. And we have someone here who I am so excited to be talking to, Amy Hough, who's a pediatric sleep consultant. And she has been doing this work for about 2 years, a little over 2 years, working with lots of families in our area to try to get their kids sleeping well, which is a wonderful thing for kids and parents alike. And I had the pleasure of meeting Amy about 2 years ago now, when we had our second baby. You know, we had our first baby, and of course it was hard getting baby to sleep sometimes, as it always is, but we were able to kind of roll with it and read some books, and we made it through okay. But then we had the second baby, and of course, as many parents have experienced, it was a totally different thing. And we had the additional stressor of having an older kid, at that point a 3-year-old, who was getting woken up by the baby. My son was born with bilateral clubfoot, so we had some orthopedic things he had to wear at night that were getting in the way of sleep. We were just a hot mess at my household. So we called in Amy, and she gave us some great information about sleep, gave us a plan, and we are so grateful to her. We're then and still are for the help she gave our family. So I got to meet her and hear a lot of the good information that she shares with families 2 years ago, and we've kept up over the last few years. She's doing awesome things for families locally. And today she is doing this wonderful Facebook Live with us that gives you the opportunity to ask your questions live. So if you have any questions for Amy about pediatric sleep, feel free to ask those. Just post those down below in the comments, and we'll get to those. I'll be throwing those at Amy throughout. I think she's going to start out by sharing her tips for good sleep that she can take your questions throughout. So feel free to post those, and we will get those going. We are so excited to hear your questions about pediatric sleep, and I know many of you have lots of them. So without further delay, I will turn it over to Amy. Amy, do you want to tell a little bit more about yourself and get us started today?
Sure. Yes. Thank you, Laura. Thanks for having me. I love to talk about sleep. I'm hugely passionate about it. So I'm excited to do that this morning and to answer questions. And I just want to say that I have been where all of you are before. It wasn't that long ago that we had an infant and a toddler that both were not sleeping well. And so we've really been in the depths of the sleep deprivation as well. And now that we're on the other side, that has made such a huge impact on our lives. So I hope that some of the things that I share will be helpful and can get you guys on the other side as well. So one thing that I found really interesting when I started sleep consulting is a statistic that I'll share. And that is that if you don't do anything to try to correct your child's sleep habits, and I checked back with you in a few years, that 80% of you would say that the same child is still having issues sleeping. So that is something that I have found over the last few years to be really true. You know, when a mom of a toddler reaches out, oftentimes she will tell me that that child never slept well. And of course, there are exceptions, but in general, that's been really true. But the good news is that sleep can be corrected. It's typically behavioral things that we can help change course, and they can learn to be a really awesome sleeper. So that's the good news. And I really feel that that's a gift to give your child, to have those skills to be able to sleep well and get the rest that they need. And that really benefits them throughout their life. So what can you do right now to get started on that path of having really good sleep habits for your children? So the first tip that I want to share is that it's really important to eliminate what we call a sleep crutch or prop. And so falling asleep, it really is a skill. It's a process. It takes a lot of repetition and practice for a child to go from being wide awake to being fast asleep on their own. But the problems come up in how they do that. So when I'm working with a new family, I'm trying to find what is this child's sleep crutch. There might be several of them. And it can be a variety of things. Oftentimes it's feeding to sleep. So that could be a bottle or nursing. It could be being rocked to sleep or patted to sleep, or a pacifier, or laying down with mom or dad. So all of those things can be what we call an external sleep crutch. And for lots of kids, it might work fine for a while, but then at some point it sort of stops working effectively, and it starts to prevent good sleep at night. It really starts to fragment their sleep. And the reason for that is because we all go through sleep cycles in the night. For a child, it's pretty brief, only 45 minutes to an hour long. So each time that they're going from one cycle to the next, they have a brief wake up. And so let's say, for example, your baby fell asleep in your arms feeding, and then they wake up in the crib and they're alone, and they don't know how to get back to sleep without that assistance. So even if they're not necessarily hungry, they're going to call out for help because they need you to feed again. They need to have that sucking and that closeness in order to fall asleep. That's just the only way they know how. So it makes sense, but that's obviously pretty frustrating as a parent, for sure. So it is often kind of a foreign concept to parents that, yes, you can put your baby into the crib awake. So that's really the key, is that we need that baby or that child to learn to fall asleep in their sleep space independently, in order for them to be able to do that again throughout the night. So they really need that internal strategy for falling asleep. So it makes sense, but it's easier said than done, for sure.
Well, and Amy, do you ever find that sometimes parents hold on to those sleep crutches as much as kids do? I know it was really hard for me to I started out rocking my little babies to sleep at night, and that was wonderful for both of us, and it was working for us. But then all of a sudden, I had a 2-year-old that still needed rocked to sleep every night and multiple times through the night, and that became much harder. But it was tough for me emotionally to give up the idea of rocking my baby to sleep, even though my baby wasn't a baby anymore. Do you find that parents have a hard time giving that up?
I do, yes, and it is hard, for sure. I think that my biggest advice to parents is that you just have to find a different time of day to get that bonding in. It doesn't have to be right before sleep. It can be when they wake up from sleep or during a feeding during the day. But finding other times to have that bonding experience, because yes, it is hard to give that up for sure.
Yes. We have a few comments coming in on Facebook, which is great to see. We have one person, Angie, here, who's giving you a nice shout out. She is saying Amy is an amazing resource, and she has a question about sleep schedules. We have a number of great questions coming in. I'm trying to see if there are any specifically about sleep crutches, what you just talked about. I think that what you just discussed is really relevant to Elizabeth. She's posting, our son goes to sleep great, but almost every night wakes up at different times, starts screaming, and it takes several hours being a parent and a parent sleeping on his floor to fall back to sleep. Is that something that you would suspect some sort of sleep crutch is happening, or what would you think is maybe going on there with Elizabeth?
I would assume that yes, at the onset of sleep, they're probably, even if the baby isn't going into the crib completely asleep, even if they're just a little bit drowsy, what that means is that, Elizabeth, you may have done part of that work for your child. And so actually going into the crib wide awake is going to be necessary. But still, in the beginning of the process of sleep training, there's going to be some night wake ups that need to be worked through for sure. And that's the hard part as far as guiding when I don't have all of the information. But essentially, you want to pick a sleep training method that you're comfortable with. Ferber method is one that a lot of people use. The one that I teach is called a stay in the room method, or a gradual retreat. And so if you're having to lay on the floor, you would essentially be getting further and further away from the crib over a period of, about a week or so, until you can be out of the room. It's not an easy process, especially if your child is prone to doing a lot of protest. So definitely, if you need some extra help with that, reach out and let me know. But that, I would assume that there's probably a little bit of help happening at the bedtime.
Okay.
Anything else?
Yeah, we have a number of things. So I might let you get through a few more of your tips for sleep before we do that. Okay. We do have another one related to what you discussed from Amara. She says, we do rocking now or patting on the back, and once he's asleep, he'll sleep for 6 hours and then need to eat. But most of the time, it takes 2 or 3 times laying him down at night for him to fall asleep. So I think that's relevant to what you were talking about with the rocking and patting. Do you feel like that's a common sleep crutch for parents?
It definitely is, and I do see it get more difficult as the child gets older. It does tend to start taking longer and longer. And to me, that's almost a sign that they're ready for a strategy of their own, because what you're doing isn't necessarily helpful to that falling asleep process. So that they can gain some self-soothing skills and some strategies of their own, they'll be able to fall asleep more easily.
That's great. So what are some other tips? We talked about sleep crutches and the importance of moving beyond those. What other tips do we have for parents on getting their kiddos to sleep?
Yes. So my second tip is to have an early bedtime. So overtiredness is something that a lot of you may have heard of before, but that's really an important concept to know, because it really is the enemy to sleep for a child. It makes settling into sleep more difficult, and it makes their sleep more restless. So we want to make sure that they are not going into sleep overly tired. And that means that they're getting enough daytime rest, age appropriate. And so what comes most natural for most children is a bedtime between 7 and 8 p.m., which for a lot of families that can be difficult to achieve. It seems really early, and especially in the summertime. But I think one thing to look at is, what time does your child naturally wake up in the morning? For most kids, I find that it's between 6 and 7. So if that's true for your child, then they really need that early bedtime in order to get enough hours of sleep at night. I mean, we're generally wanting them to get between 10 to 12 hours of nighttime sleep. So I would think about that. And then also, for most of us, our body clock, our circadian rhythm has kind of a natural dip after dinner time. So that's going to be when it's easiest to get your child to fall asleep, is between that 7 to 8 o'clock time frame. Because if you wait longer, that's when you start to see some of that kind of bouncing off the walls, and all of a sudden they've got this surge of energy, it seems, and for a baby, they might be inconsolably crying. So all of those things can start to happen when they have gone past that point when it would have been easier for them to fall asleep. Newborns are an exception. They do have a later bedtime. But at about 3 months old is when you can start following that bedtime between 7 and 8-ish.
Okay.
Okay, so that's great.
I think about bedtimes from Katie on Facebook, and Katie says, my 18-month-old wakes up at 5 a.m. every morning. If I lay him back down or try to pretend he's not awake and stay out of the room, he'll cry until it's time to get up anyway. We tried later bedtime, earlier bedtime, no luck, same wake up time. As much as I love the extra time with him, Mom and Dad are really tired of waking up at 5 a.m. too. Any tips?
Yes, that is way too early for anyone, for sure.
Hard agree.
Yes, absolutely. So as far as a schedule for an 18-month-old, typically they're doing one nap, and it normally falls just after lunchtime. So somewhere between noon and 1, going down for the nap would be ideal. And then kind of depends on how long their nap was. If it's a good length of a nap, then I think 7:30 or 8 might be fine for the bedtime. If the nap is shorter, then it may need to be closer to 7. But as far as the early morning wake up, that it is a common thing. Some of the main culprits there would be, one, how dark is the room? So especially this time of year, I see this happen more frequently because it's just the sun is coming in even just a tiny bit, and that can cause a wake up. So do whatever you need to do to get the room completely blacked out. This can be kind of difficult to achieve. A lot of the curtains that you can find, they really just darken the room, but they don't completely black it out. So you can find actual covers that like Velcro onto the window that completely cover it. You can do thick blinds with the blackout curtains on top. You might need to kind of tape down the edges or something. It might not look pretty, but I would recommend doing that for sure. The other thing I would think about is what's happening when your child wakes up. So you want to make sure that the first few things are kind of boring, so that they're not anticipating something heavily. So, doing a diaper change first, maybe just having a few minutes to play before you're offering breakfast, or nursing or cuddling in your bed, some of those types of things, or TV can be really anticipated. But if you just, do a diaper change, get dressed, maybe have a regular breakfast, and then move on to some of those other things that they really look forward to, I think that can be helpful with the early wake up.
Those are great tips. And getting the room dark is one thing you worked with Matt and I on. We had this nursery guide with bright blue walls and bright yellow curtains that let in all this beautiful sunlight. And we thought it was so cute. But one of Amy's tips was to get it darker. And so we got on Amazon, we got some inexpensive blackout curtains that were dark blue, still very cute, still went with the nursery really well. And that made a huge difference for us. One of the better tips I think we got. So I fully endorse making the nursery darker tip, and it can still be very cute, even if it gets dark at night. Okay, so we talked about crutches, we talked about early bedtimes. Tip number 3, Amy.
Tip number 3 is establishing a routine for sleep. So that's just a really excellent cue for your child's body and their brain that it's time for sleep. We all naturally produce melatonin, so if they've got a sleep routine, that kind of cues their body to get ready for sleep. You don't want it to last too long, though. Somewhere around a half an hour is plenty long enough, but you do want to keep the steps in the same order each night. I would do some of the routine in your child's room or wherever it is that they sleep. One thing to avoid is any kind of screens, TV, tablets, phones. Those can really impact our natural levels of melatonin, and that goes for adults as well, but especially children. Oftentimes they are more impacted by that. So my general rule of thumb is have all of those screens off a couple of hours before bedtime. In our house, it's just a rule that by dinner, the TV goes off and we just find other things to do as a family that are enjoyable, but don't include those screens. Another thing that I recommend is that if you're a 2-parent household, that you take turns doing the bedtime routine. So that might be every other night that you're switching off. But I think it's important that children can be put down by either parent. And so eventually they can be put down by a grandparent, and you might be able to, get out for a date or whatever in the evening time, but that one parent doesn't feel that weight of responsibility. And then also have a little nap time routine as well. This one would be even shorter, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. Maybe a diaper change, put a sleep sack on, one book and one song. That could be a good nap time routine. But that lets them know what's coming. And then an example of a bedtime routine might be that you start with the feed first. I almost always recommend that because, again, if we're wanting to get the child into bed awake, then we need to have a little bit more space between the feeding and going down for bed. So do that first, and you might need to do it in a different spot than you usually do. You might need to strip them down to just a diaper so that they're a little less comfortable, and maybe wear a long necklace that they might be able to kind of play with to distract themselves and keep them awake. But start with that. That's usually the most common mistake that I see, is that the feed comes last and the baby starts to get pretty drowsy, if not completely asleep, before they're transferred to their bed. After the feed, you could do bath time. Then pajamas, sleep sack, maybe a book, song, and then into the bed at that point. So that would be a pretty good and healthy bedtime routine. Do we have any questions about any of that?
Routines, not specifically about bedtime routines. We have a lot of questions though, so I might start throwing them at you just we move through a little. We've got a few that are kind of similar. I see one from Billy and I see one from Kendra. It looks like they have similar ages of kids, although you might end up disagreeing. We'll see. Can answer these separately or together. Billy says, how do I get my 6-year-old to go to sleep in her own bed by herself? And then we also have Kendra who says, I have an 8-year-old and he doesn't want to sleep in his bed and does not want to go to sleep at bedtime. So we've got some parents of some older kiddos. It sounds like mainly the issue going to bed. And it looks like, at least for Kendra, being able to stay asleep is also tough. So man, parents working hard out there with those older kiddos, tips for them.
Yeah, working with older kids, I love working with them because they can definitely understand rules and things changes that we establish around sleep, which is helpful. But I think that's one thing that's really important is having some really black and white rules around sleep that you discuss with them before you start making changes. With older kids, you want to make sure that they're not crashing and having any kind of little nap before bedtime. I see that happen sometimes, maybe in the late afternoon or evening, that they're getting a little bit of a nap and then they're just going to have a hard time falling asleep at bedtime. So make sure that's not happening. And then I always use an okay to wake clock for older kids because they do need a visual of when it's okay to get out of bed, when it's nighttime, when it's morning time. With an 8-year-old, you could use just a regular clock, assuming that they can tell time, and put some parameters around that. But I think that's important to establish when it's sleep time, when it's morning time. And then oftentimes older kids have some fears that you might need to work through and do some exercises with them to address those things. So, there are lots of activities you could do. You could have a piece of paper with some balloons drawn and write down their fears in each balloon and have them imagine that those are floating up to the sky and going away. You can use what I call room spray, which is just a water bottle with maybe a little bit of essential oil in it. You let them spray it at bedtime only, and you just simply say that keeps their room safe all night. You don't need to use a lot of verbiage around it. I don't call it monster spray because I don't like to validate that monsters could be real. So you want to be cautious about how you're speaking about the fears that they might have. So those are helpful. And then if you're having to lay down with them, when you start these changes, I would either sit on the floor or in a chair, but not in the bed, and have that be the first goal, is just that they have to fall asleep without you laying in their bed. And then again, you're going to gradually move further away and get them comfortable over a period of time. It's not something that you want to do all at once, because we want to build their confidence and independence around it. I also used rewards and consequences with older kids, so that they will learn to make good choices around sleep. So yeah, those are my suggestions for older kids.
Those are some great ideas. We've got parents in the comments who are really relating and connecting to each other, which is great, around difficulties with sleep. This is something that is such a common experience for parents. So we'll keep going through questions. Yes. Why don't we do another tip before we take a few more?
Okay. So my fourth tip is to consider the room environment. Keep in mind that we all sleep best in sort of a cave-like environment. So we've already talked about room darkness. That's super important. If we are talking about toddlers, probably at least two and older, that may be complaining about the dark, at that point you could introduce a nightlight, but make sure that it's glowing red or orange. Those colors will impact their sleep less than if it were, a white or a blue or a green type of light. And I would also place it behind a piece of furniture so that it's not quite as bright. But if they're not complaining about the dark, or they're young enough that they can't verbally complain about it, then I wouldn't worry about it. I would keep everything very dark. White noise is helpful for blocking out environmental noise, both from outside and inside the house. So that can be helpful. I prefer that it's truly just a clean sound that a fan would put off, not music or even nature sounds. I think it's best if it's just that clean white noise. Sleeping temperature between 68 and 72 degrees is ideal. And then also remove any kind of distractions. So thin out the toys. You want to be sure to pick up toys before sleep time. You can remove mobiles, glow-in-the-dark items, projectors, any of those types of things that are truly more of a distraction than a help when it comes to sleep.
Those are great tips. And again, earlier about those nurseries being dark, that was so helpful for our family. We did have a question not related as much to sleep environment, although maybe, and this could be one where you need more information from the family. So feel free to say that, because this is a very diverse population. We know that. But Sandra says, I have a son with autism who will not stay asleep all night. We don't have the age here, which could make it a little tricky. So you might add that in, Sandra. But do you have any specific tips? I know, again, that's a very diverse population, but specific tips for parents to have a child with an autism spectrum disorder?
Yes, that's a good question. And I haven't personally worked with a child that has autism, but I have had a little bit of training when it comes to their sleep. One thing that I've found interesting is that actually kids with autism, they may do worse with white noise. So having things really very quiet is probably going to be more helpful for them. I also know that weighted blankets can be helpful for kids with autism. So that's something to try, but you want to be sure that it's customized for your child's weight. There is a local person that makes those customized blankets. Her name's Shelly, but anyway, you don't want to just go out and buy one from Walmart or Target. You want it to be weighted for how much they weigh, but that can be helpful. And then also anything that you can do to give your child a visual is helpful. So an actual bedtime routine chart with pictures is helpful. The okay to wake clock is very helpful, assuming that this is a toddler or older, because that visual for them is really key in knowing when it's okay to be in bed or out of bed.
Those are great tips. Thank you.
Sure.
And we have a question from Mara as well. And she says, at what age do you start letting them fall asleep on their own? Is 3 months too early? I think Amara sounds like she needs some rest. That is such a hard time, Amara. We hear you.
Yes.
We hear you. So let's hear what Amy has to say about, is 3 months too early? When can we have the expectation that they start falling asleep on their own?
Sure. No, it's not too early. And in fact, you can start doing that, even a couple of weeks after you bring them home from the hospital. It's not something that you have to worry about doing at every nap. Obviously, they're sleeping a lot when they're newborns. But I'm typically suggesting with a newborn that parents are working on at least one crib nap a day, where you're kind of moving in that direction of getting them into the crib at least drowsy, and then working towards being more awake. So for that one nap, and then bedtime as well, and doing that each day. So yeah, that's something you can start when they're quite young, and definitely by 3 months. As far as actual formal sleep training, I don't recommend starting that until they're about 4 months old. As far as, pushing them more to fall asleep independently at each sleep time and sleep those longer stretches. You want to be a bit more gentle before you hit that point.
That makes a lot of sense. And one more here from Kelly before we go on to our next tip. She says, best advice to break the pacifier at bedtime habit for a toddler. She's been off bottles since she was 1 and doesn't have her pacifier at all during the day, but still insists on it to fall asleep, and we are now approaching 3. Thoughts for Kelly on that?
Yes. So with pacifiers, I always have parents just go cold turkey. I think that it just causes confusion and frustration if you try to somehow wean them from it. But they can be at that age pretty involved in the process. There are lots of cute little methods out there that you can do. I've read about the Binky Fairy coming and taking the pacifiers and sending them to a baby that needs them. Things like that you can have your toddler be involved in the process. But I would do it all in one fell swoop and gather them all up and get rid of them and get them out of the house so that they're not a temptation. And it will be a few rough bedtimes, but you've really got to stick to your guns. Once you make that decision, they're not available any longer, and be sure that you don't give in and go back to them once you make that decision to start.
Those are some awesome tips. It's tough. Man, my daughter loved her Binkies. Son, not into Binkies. That's often true for kids, but that was a tough transition for my daughter as well. So I hear you on that. All right.
Yeah, it's hard, but
next,
they're out of sight, out of mind pretty quickly.
Yeah. Next tip, and then we'll take some more questions after. I think we're on, where are we at? We talked about sleep environment last. So tip number 5.
Yes. Tip number 5 is that skipping nap or doing a late bedtime will affect the next 24 hours. So essentially, it is a myth that skipping the nap or putting your child to bed really late is going to make them sleep longer or better. That goes back to that concept of overtiredness. So it really is important to have your child on an appropriate schedule. If you are trying to skip naps, they are going to build up what we call a sleep debt, and it really is probably going to backfire and make things worse. So you want to honor your child's need for sleep. Also keep in mind that a nap in the car is not the same quality as a nap at home in their bed. So have a balance there too, that maybe one day you are out and about and you have a nap in the car, but try to prioritize the others, making sure that they happen at home, or the next day that you are home for those naps and bedtimes. You just don't want to do too many missed naps or late bedtimes in a row, because that can really start to cause kind of a regression with sleep. So the other thing that's important too is the timing of the daytime sleep. At each age, there is kind of an appropriate amount of time that your child can handle being awake at a time. And so you want to be paying attention to that and making sure that you're setting them up as well as possible going into the night. So I do have a chart that I wanted to share. I will try to pull that up on screen here.
Okay. We'll see if we can get this pulled up. And if we have issues with that, we'll be sure to post it in the comments as well. But I bet we can get it up here for folks.
Yeah. Okay. Can you see that chart?
They will in just one moment here. Let's see. In the meantime, while we're getting this pulled together, guys, keep those questions coming. All of you have had such great questions. Let's see here. There we go.
Yeah, so once that pops up, you might just take a screenshot of it. So what it's going to give you is a range of ages for your child, how many naps that they're going to need at that age, and then where it says time awake, that column is pretty important. That's how much time they can handle being awake between sleeps. And then you've got just kind of an average duration of naps, when bedtime should fall, total sleep that they need per day. So that can be really helpful when trying to figure out a schedule for your child. A lot of people ask, when can I have a set schedule where I know what time my baby's going to sleep every day? And really that doesn't come until about 6-7 months old, when they can handle taking their naps at the same time on the clock each day. So for example, a 7-month-old is typically doing 2 naps, one in the morning around 9:30 or so, one in the afternoon around 2 or 2:30 would be ideal. But before that, you really want to just focus on that time awake, because we don't know how long their nap is going to last. And if it was short, they may not be able to make it to their nap time. So you want to just focus on, okay, I know my child is in this range and they need about 2 hours of time awake, and then that's what you follow, even if it's a little bit different timing than the day before. I hope that makes sense.
Yes,
Okay.
that does. And we have some questions popping up about naps, which is great. I have one here from Kelly. She says, when should toddlers cut out daytime naps? Gosh, Kelly, my answer for you is as late as humanly possible. Let's hear from the expert. I wish my 5-year-old napped. But what are your thoughts on that? When should toddlers cut out the daytime nap?
Yeah, that's a great question. In general, toddlers will stop napping between age 3 and 5. And it kind of depends on how their night sleep is going and of course just the child. Some have higher sleep needs than others. But the way that I determine if a toddler needs to drop their nap is by how they're doing at bedtime. So if, let's say, if your 3-year-old, you're trying to get them to sleep at 8 and they're not falling asleep until, 9:30, that's way too long and too late. So if they can't fall asleep by, I would say, about 8:30, then the nap probably needs to go. It's interfering too much. And in that case, I would move to just doing quiet time during the afternoon in place of the nap. One thing you can try before dropping the nap completely is just shortening it. So you can shorten the nap to maybe 90 minutes or 45 minutes to an hour, and kind of experiment with that and see if that buys you a little bit of extra time, and is helpful in how quickly they fall asleep at bedtime. If it doesn't make any difference there, then I would just get rid of it altogether.
We have another question about naps related that comes from Hannah. And Hannah says, what about a 3-year-old who is trying to drop her nap or napping less frequently? If she naps, we wake her up by 3:30, and then she sometimes won't fall asleep until 9:30. If she doesn't nap, we get her up at 2:30, and then she is a mess, and it's hard to get her through dinner. Oh, this sounds like a transition phase. I feel like I've had this. It's sounding familiar to me. And I feel you on that. That's rough. What's your advice, Amy?
Yes, it is definitely a hard transition and a hard adjustment. I think it's fine if your toddler does, a few naps throughout the week, for, a couple month period of time. But yeah, at some point you're just going to have to go ahead and get rid of it completely. And at that time in the afternoon where they're starting to get cranky or seeming to want to fall asleep, you've got to use the power of distraction. Maybe get outside for some fresh air, playtime out there, or give them a snack that will kind of give them a boost. Something like a fruit with some natural sugars, things like that to help boost their mood and their energy and just distract them until bedtime. And then you are going to have to do an earlier bedtime during that transition period. So putting a toddler to bed at 6:30 or 7 is not too early. It seems very early, but that may be what they need to kind of get through that adjustment period.
Those are great tips. I see some other questions coming in. So Bailey, Aaron, we'll get to you. Same with Amira. We will get to those. I know Amy we've had some great sleep tips. She's talked about sleep crutches, early bedtimes, establishing that routine, the sleep environment, avoiding the skipping naps. And boy, that car nap tip you just gave, that was one you had to work with Matt and I on, because we were really relying on the car nap, and we thought a nap is a nap, right? You had to teach us that restorative sleep comes from being able to nap in a crib, and it did make a big difference. So that was tough, though. That was a crutch for us. Just drive around if they won't nap. So
it's hard.
What's our sixth sleep tip, and then we can dive into some of the rest of our questions.
Okay, so I have one more tip that has to do with night feeds, and then I also have a few things about toddlers to share. So hopefully, let me try to get through this night feed stuff real quick.
Great.
But I think that it's important that you handle that correctly if you have a baby that's still night feeding. As a general rule of thumb, most babies are capable of sleeping through the night at about 6 months old, given that they are growing well, eating well, and all of that. And you may want to check with their pediatrician first. But that's kind of my general rule of thumb. But if they are younger than that and they're still needing to feed, then we want to handle it appropriately so that hopefully they will just wake when they're hungry and not more frequently than needed. I would recommend that you do a diaper change first. We want to kind of break up the wake up possible, few minutes of crying with getting fed. And then also it's easier to keep them at least a little bit awake if they're less comfortable. So do the diaper change, keep pajamas off, and then keep things low key, quiet. You don't want to do a lot of smiling and playing with them during that time. But you do need a little bit of light that you can keep an eye on them. As soon as they're not actively feeding any longer, then you want to go ahead and end the night feed, get them dressed again, and put back into the crib, ideally not completely asleep at that point. That way they can use their skills again to get back to sleep, and you're not perpetuating that feed-sleep association. And then I would also follow what we call an eat, play, sleep pattern during the daytime. So that just means that making sure feeds are not happening right before sleep. We talked about distancing it from bedtime, but it's important at naps as well that, there's maybe 30, 45 minutes where you're not feeding a bottle or breast at that point, because they will definitely be at risk for falling asleep. So try to space those feeds so that they happen when they wake up from sleep, or maybe kind of in the middle of that window where they're awake, but not right before. So that's the night feeds. And then to touch a little bit more on toddler sleep. Toddlers love to push boundaries. They are definitely trying to kind of figure out their independence, and so they need very clear rules around sleep. And I would get them involved by letting them help create their bedtime routine, do some things that they enjoy doing, maybe make a chart with them. And then you want to stick to that chart. Avoid giving into all of those little stall tactics that they have. So if you find that you're tucking them into bed and then they are requesting a drink of water, well, let's put that drink of water as part of the bedtime routine. They can mark it off as they go along. And you just have to stick to, this is our routine. We do each step one time, and that's it. But try to include those things that they like to ask for in their routine, and then just be strict about that. We talked about the okay to wake clock. Those are really helpful. And then it is best to wait to switch to a big kid bed until they're a little bit older. So ideally age 3, 2.5 can be okay depending on the child. But you don't want to make that transition too soon, because toddlers do not have a lot of impulse control. So if you put them down awake right when they turn 2 in a bed, they are probably going to get out of it quite a bit. So I would recommend trying to push that off later if you can. Crib climbing does become an issue for some kids. I've got some blog posts and Facebook posts about how to deal with that. But try to wait if you can. Toddlers need at least 10 hours of night sleep. So make sure that they're getting at least that. That would probably be if they're still having a nap. they're not having a nap, then they probably need closer to that 12 hours of nighttime sleep. If they're 3 or 4 and have dropped that nap. Okay, yeah, I think that's all I've got. So hit me with more questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are great tips for toddlers. Boy, toddlers are so wonderful and joyful, right? And they have a way of pushing buttons. And I know I've got one of those at home right now. They're tough. So that's great advice. We have a couple positive comments to start with before we dive into questions. Amara says, I just rocked my baby for a few minutes to calm him down, laid him down awake. He fussed for about 15 minutes and then fell asleep. Thank you for the advice. So we had, just in our broadcast here, we have a successful nap for Amara. Which we're thrilled about. So, way to go, Amara. I don't know if you're still tuning in or if you're off enjoying a well-deserved cup of coffee, but you do you, whatever you're doing, enjoy that time. We also have Kelly Cruz who says, awesome help. Thank you so much for the advice you gave her. So some positive thoughts from folks. Let's dive into a few of the questions we've had. So we've got one from Bailey here. Bailey has a question about a 3-year-old. She says, my 3-year-old takes 30 to 45 minutes to fall asleep. That's after our routine is reading stories and calming down. I've gradually moved out of her room and I sit in the hall so she can still see me. And then after 10 or 15 minutes, move to my room. She typically stays in her bed, but takes forever to actually fall asleep. Any advice to get her to fall asleep faster? Or is this a problem? I would add. She's staying in her bed. That's pretty good for a 3-year-old. Way to go, Bailey.
Yeah, I would say that, a half an hour to fall asleep isn't terrible. If it were closer to 15 minutes or so, I would say that'd be more ideal. But we went through that with our youngest as well. And it was mainly just me not wanting to mess with his nap. And so I was just accepting that it took him longer to fall asleep at bedtime. But you can definitely start experimenting with the nap. You can do, like I mentioned earlier, try shortening it a little bit. You can try making bedtime a little bit later. I don't know what you're at right now, but just making those small tweaks to the schedule to see if that helps a little bit with how quick she falls asleep. I'd also wonder, again, about how light it is in the room, at what time she's going to bed. Possibly that could make a difference too if it were darker.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And for those just tuning in, I think that's the 3rd or 4th time we've said it, but we'll say it again, the blackout curtains. That was Amy's tip that helps my family, and it will help yours too. We also have a question here from Aaron. Aaron says, is it too late to sleep train my 8-month-old? He doesn't sleep well at all. He wakes up several times through the night and needs to be rocked back to sleep. He often wakes up as well if the pacifier comes out of his mouth. Oh, Aaron, my son did that too. That made me crazy. This mama is tired. We also have a 3.3-and-a-half-year-old. So they have an 8-month-old and a 3.5-year-old who has recently become scared of everything in his room and now will not sleep in his own bed. Please help. So we might divide those up. The first piece of that was, is it too late to sleep train my 8-month-old?
No, absolutely not. It's never too late, in my opinion. So, yep, I would absolutely move forward with doing some sleep training with the baby, and you can absolutely get them sleeping well. That's a very common age of when people reach out to me for one-on-one help. Is somewhere, around 6, 7, 8 months. That's very, very common. And then as far as your toddler, being fearful it's definitely normal. That I see that happen a lot. And so again, I think doing a more gradual approach for them is really important. We wouldn't want to rip you out of the equation all at once, but rather try to build some confidence over a week or 2 period of time, to get some independence going. Toddlers do respond well to having a reward for making positive changes around their sleep. So you can have them involved in that as far as what's an immediate reward that they could get in the morning. Even if all they did was had a really good bedtime where they fell asleep more independently than usual, and letting them pick out something that they might receive in the morning. Having a consequence is important as well. You do want to be careful that you're not making the fear worse, but a lot of this is very behavioral. Kids do seek attention, whether it's positive or negative attention. So I would say that it is important to have some kind of consequence when they're not following the rules around sleep. So, for example, you could do something simple like taking away their Lovey or their stuffed animal for a couple of minutes at a time and then returning it and saying, if you get out of bed again, I'll have to take it longer. And that can be a good incentive to follow the rules that you've set around sleep. And one other thing about attention for toddlers, they do really well when you give them 15 minutes of consecutive one-on-one time each day. So that's one parent, one child, giving them your full attention, doing whatever activity they would like to do. When you can meet some of that need for attention during the daytime, it tends to help with when it comes to sleep time, that they're not seeking that quite as much.
That's a great tip. So that means that I'll be playing Scooby-Doo a lot if I stick to that, which is all my 3-year-old, 2.5-year-old wants to play right now. We have a question from Ashley, and this may be a pediatrician question, but I'll let you decide that, Amy. Ashley says, my 18-month-old is having involuntary breathing holding episodes, and one night he had an episode in his crib while we were sleep training, which scared us. So now we don't feel safe to make him sleep in his crib. Any advice?
I'd be curious to know what method you tried of sleep training. I have seen this come up with the holding the breath and also with throwing up at around that age or a little bit older, making themselves throw up. And oftentimes that is kind of an attention-seeking thing. I see it happen more often when parents are trying a cry it out or extinction method, meaning that they're not in the room with the child as they're learning some of these new skills. So it might be helpful to have a different approach, doing a stay in the room method where you're present the whole time. I tend to see less of those kinds of behaviors happening. Certainly, yes, I think that is something that you could bring up to the pediatrician and just make sure that they feel comfortable with you attempting the sleep training again, but like I said, maybe in a different strategy.
That's good advice. Folks, put in if you've got any final questions. Let's go ahead and get those in. We've kept Amy a little past 11, but she's been gracious with us and let us keep asking her things. So we're grateful for that. But put in last questions if you've got any more before we log off. We've got one more from Caitlin, and Caitlin is saying or asking, when you tweak a schedule, so we've talked a lot about tweaking that time schedules and sort of experimenting. How many times should you try doing that before saying this isn't working?
Good question. I would give a schedule change probably at least 4 to 7 days before you decide that it's not helping, and try something different. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's good information. So keep trying that and see if it works a little bit. And that is so hard. I would just want to echo, we've had a lot of parents on the chat just talking about how difficult these things are. And yes, Amy and I are both parents, and I think know well how incredibly challenging this is. And I don't think there's very many things that are harder as a parent than managing sleep when you aren't getting enough sleep and your kids aren't. It's so stressful. So reach out for help and support. And the other thing that I want to emphasize, this is probably my big takeaway from what Amy said today. I really appreciate her thoughts around, in two-parent households, making sure that we're alternating getting kids to bed and some of those responsibilities. I think in my household, we fell into the idea that part of having a stable routine is having the same parent put the kid down every time. And it doesn't sound like that needs to be the case. In fact, it's really important that both caregivers are doing that. So if you're in a two-parent household, I really want to emphasize what Amy said about trying to alternate and make sure that both parents are able to put kiddo down. That helps parents too. Like, that's going to help our brains and help us get the rest we need to be the best parents we can be during the day, because a parent getting no sleep is not parenting their best.
Right.
So ask for help from friends, family, Amy Hough, whoever you need to, but make sure parents are alternating and everybody's taking on responsibilities, because that's really critical for kids and parents too. So that's my big takeaway, Amy, in addition to all the other wonderful things you helped my family with over time. Any last tips, anything we haven't talked about that we want to before we sign off?
I would just end it with, that change is really hard. Sometimes it's easier to keep doing what we're doing, even if it's not working, because the idea of changing things and possibly dealing with some protest seems more daunting than just living with it. But I think that you've got to keep that light at the end of the tunnel in mind, and just know that this is really a short-term thing. It's not going to harm your child, and in fact, it's really going to benefit them for years to come. Also, that there's no shame in seeking extra help around this, because it is very, very difficult. So I would just say that, don't keep living with the sleep deprivation. It may not resolve on its own, and you might as well do what you need to do right now to correct things. And if you want that extra support, definitely reach out, shoot me an email. I am actually going on maternity leave in a few weeks, so we will have a third little one, but I've got a few spots that I could take on a few new families if you want that one-on-one custom support, which would give you a plan and also the moral support and the accountability, and to be able to troubleshoot with me through the whole process. So don't hesitate to reach out. If you want just more, free help, resources, the best place to follow me is on Facebook. Let me pull up.
And we will definitely have that link in the comments too. I'll be sure to make sure folks can see that. But okay. Yes, I can get you back up here.
But yeah, you can follow me on Facebook. I put lots of tips there. I do a free Q&A once a month on that Facebook page. You can also sign up for my monthly newsletter, which gives you a sleep topic. You can check out my blogs on my website. So lots of free sleep information in those places.
Okay. That's great. And we have just one, I'll squeeze it in here at the end. We have one final question that rolled in.
Sure.
I think it'll be it's a good one, and it's one I used to have too. Angie, she's saying, I know you mentioned naps in the car, but how do you handle the naps when you get home if they fall asleep between nap times while in the car? So, you go to the grocery store, you're coming back home for the nap, and they fall asleep in the car. Do you still try to put them down for the nap? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say for most babies or kids, they probably won't transfer all that well from the car seat to the crib. They're probably going to wake up during that transition, and it doesn't take a lot of sleep for kids to feel sort of refreshed and like they've caught a second wind. So you can definitely try transferring to their bed. But if that's something that doesn't really work for them, then I would say just hang out in the car a little bit longer. Let them have, maybe a 30, 45-minute cat nap, and then just call the nap over at that point, and either wait until their next nap time, or maybe you need to adjust bedtime just a little bit earlier that day since the nap was shorter than it might normally be. So yeah.
Great question from Angie. We've all been there, Angie. You see him falling
Yes.
asleep in the back seat and you're like, no. It's rough. It's rough. Well, good luck, parents out there, sleep-deprived parents. We've got your back. Amy is wonderful to follow on Facebook. Be sure to follow her at Amy Hough Sleep Consulting on Facebook, and I will drop her link to the page in the comments. I believe it's in the description as well, but I'll make sure that's easy to find. Certainly give her a follow. If you have other experts you'd like to talk with here on Facebook Live from the Discovery Center, please let us know. Amy is here because we've had parents suggest that she would be a great resource for them and that they needed help with sleep issues. We've had pediatricians join us before. We have some other folks planned, but we'd love to hear what experts we can bring to you that will be helpful for you as you're parenting, especially during this pandemic. So feel free to drop suggestions or thoughts in the comments about other experts we can bring. We appreciate everyone tuning in live with us here on Facebook, and we hope all of you have a wonderful day and a very restful night. Thanks for joining us.